My name is Dr. Rick Saguil.
And action. Hey, Jay had a... This is Kirk again. And action. Hey everyone, it's Dr. Rick. And Patty had a question about carb cycling. More just about carbs. Especially has, well, I might as well say the story. As Patty was into keto and now reintroduced carbs, she's feeling very tired. I'm not sure what time of the day, but common phenomenon, and we'll talk about why that initiates a hormone response. And also with regards to exercise and changing around heavy lifting or introducing heavy lifting, that will also put a little bit of a strain on the rebuilding phase, which is really cool because I've had other patients, specifically runners and walkers, race walkers, not just walking, who have had an issue with trying to dial in their macronutrient and their calories, mostly their fuel. Let's just call it neutral fuel. And it is now February, so I have a lot of folks that are kind of tapping out and deprioritizing the need to weight loss or lose weight. And it's frustrating because you try as best as you can on your own and it doesn't get anywhere. But you have to be patient. But if this is the first time you're finding me, hopefully you'll like the video, put a thumbs up later, and hit the notification bell for finding out when I do more videos, but also subscribe. So I hopefully will be able to get you guys to my tried and true subscribers to enjoy and learn from my videos. If you're new, hopefully a couple of bullet points come out. Now you gotta listen. I mean, most of the time I think the average watch time on YouTube is like 4 minutes. But I'll just tell you as a preemptive strike, that's important to, if you want a 4-minute answer, go to your doctor. He's got a 4-minute answer. He's got a 4-minute answer inside of in the form of a pill and or surgery. So if you want the answer, a real answer, it's gotta be formulated. And for the formula designed to work for you, it really has to be tailor-made for you. I'm trying to do it at a certain level. I try to do it just so it kind of generally fits most people. So how do we first manipulate this food source of ours? It is really tough. I mean, it's tougher as you get older, but definitely as you hit middle age, metabolism, metabolic rate, basal metabolic rate slows down. And sometimes it just becomes very frustrating because if you do the best you can and you still have issues, it can be very, it can break your motivation. You pour all this effort in, you line all the ducks up and nothing happens for a month. It would be nice if you, like in your 20s, you cut back, you calorically restricted, you exercise a little bit, and the weight magically melts off. But there's a lot of things that happen as you get older where the body starts to become more efficient. Metabolic rate slows down. And that's in efforts to have the older species survive. Because there is wisdom and experience in the older species to teach the younger of the species to hunt and to get through life's challenges. But obviously as one gets older, there's a certain break point where you have the wisdom, but you can't hunt anymore because physicality is kind of out the window and arthritis is setting in. Has a predator. Has a human that's predator or prey, whatever you want to call it. We do run into that problem as most Americans are overweight. So not only do you have age that adds to the decrease in metabolic rate that makes you gain weight with just the smaller portions, if not less portions than what you used to eat when you were younger, but also has you buy into the fast food industry and the stress and the multiple meals per day concepts that were given back in the 80s. They didn't work, they're wrong, and I think there's still some registered dietitians that teach that. And that's okay. For some folks, again, it's got to be tailor-made. Some folks might need that, especially post-gastric bypass. So you'll have to have small, frequent meals. However, for the average population, small, frequent meals and low fat didn't work. It got us to this point where we are now. The low fat craze was back in the 80s and 90s when doctors in the medical community thought high fat was associated with cholesterol, which we're finding it's not, especially with our PhDs. But I'm getting a little bit into the weeds. So Patty had that question that she was keto. So there's a couple of different nutrition changes you might take advantage of if you're on your own. If you're in a group like Weight Watchers and Jenny Craig, good. If you're in a group like what my coaches at TNF, Transformation Fitness and Nutrition in Elgin do, or the guys at Endorphin Effect or Paradigm Fitness, I think it's really important that you hold on to your coaches. Just check out the video I had with my Ignite Your Life conference, and you'll see how the other coaches present themselves. And they all had different philosophies, but they all had very good success rates. So keto is a practice where you're using, if you can get a something of a ketogenic diet, a well-formulated ketogenic diet is really important, because if you just dive into what you see on the internet as far as eating nothing but fat, it will work, but you run the risk that your choices in fat might be a little bit too high in the protein, because if all you're doing is steak and eggs, there is fat there, but if you take in too much protein, you're going to be initiating an insulin trigger. That's the magic of keto, is that the macronutrient fat, there's 3 macronutrients: fats, proteins, and carbohydrates. That's all I'm going to do. I don't want to get into too deep of the weeds here, but ketogenic, or a well-formulated ketogenic diet, is where you dial in a lot of fat, you dial down a lot minimal carbohydrates, maybe 20 to 30 grams a day. That's it, or even less. And then you control or modulate your protein. So fat does not turn on insulin when you eat it. Carbohydrates do turn on insulin when you eat them, so that's why, I'll talk about it later, but you want to limit the carbs. There is something called carb backloading, or carb cycling, or carb loading, that we used to do back in the 80s, but we'll talk about that in a second. So you don't want to, the ketogenic guys can get their patients their clients to lose weight, because the concept is good. If you get the body to be able to absorb and work with the fat as a fuel source instead of the carbohydrates, then when the body changes over, like a hybrid changing from electric to gasoline in its motors or its engine, you can start getting the body to recognize that there's a lot of fat here in the gut that's stored, and all that stored energy can be used. The problem that most people that don't practice a well-formulated ketogenic diet is that they keep on eating and storing a lot of fat, but the use and the hits from carbohydrates drives insulin up, so you'll never be able to take advantage of the fat because there's too much insulin in the system being spiked. Insulin is just an innocent bystander with this stuff. The problem is, if you wake up in the morning and you have a lot of carbohydrates, grains, and you also have a high cortisol level, which it's supposed to be in the morning, bad combination, because all day long from that point on you'll be secreting a lot of insulin. I probably should just mention what insulin does, which will give you the reason why Patty is diving. So let's see, I don't have a pen. Yes, I do. So I'm back. So what happens usually is that when you eat insulin, you will have the body recognize, the stomach and the mouth and the small intestine, so we'll recognize that you just had, that's your mouth, this is terrible, sorry, that's your gullet, this is where food goes down, your esophagus, and this is the stomach, and then this is a small intestine, a squiggly thingy, and then there's a large intestine, there's a little appendix, And large intestine comes out here, and that's where you dump all the food out. Beautiful. So, here you have carb. Here you have protein. Here you have fat. So we're going to selectively choose for a high carbohydrate meal. So when the carb goes in, you have carbs sitting here. Number one, the mouth can figure that it's eating or tasting carbohydrate. Sometimes it'll make amylase to start breaking things down in the saliva. Then it gets in here and your stomach realizes it's carbohydrate. So the pancreas, which is, here's the liver. Oof, that is a nasty liver. And here's the pancreas behind it, feathery. And this guy empties into here. The pancreas also empties into here, and it mixes it with the food that is coming and melting the solids. So carbohydrate makes this pancreas make insulin, because that's the way, whenever the body senses there's a lot of carbohydrate in the stomach or in the bloodstream, it has to have insulin so that it goes, the fuel source, carbohydrate, goes from the bloodstream into the cell, like the muscle cell or the liver cell or the brain cell. So if you don't have insulin around, you can't really get that fuel source from the blood into the cell. It just sits in the bloodstream, which is why a lot of insulin, or diabetics who don't have, they're insulin resistant. They don't have, they're not sensitized to insulin anymore. They're insulin resistant. So when the pancreas senses that there's a lot of carb in this meal and it secretes a lot of insulin, the cells that are supposed to take insulin combination with glucose from the bloodstream into the cells say, no, we're resistant to insulin, we're not letting that combination in. So what happens is it just floats around the bloodstream. That's why diabetics or insulin resistant patients, they'll check their finger sticks and the blood sugar will be upwards of hundreds to 200s to 400s, because it doesn't get into the cell. And that's not good, because all the cells say, hey, where's the fuel? But that's called insulin resistance. It essentially doesn't allow fuel in. So when you're in a keto, when you have a well-formulated ketogenic diet where you're taking in majority of your fuel as fat, it goes in this way. You don't secrete amylase. You don't secrete insulin, because insulin is not necessary for fat. You actually will make, you'll stimulate when the stomach senses that there's fat in here. It'll stimulate the enzymes, other enzymes of the pancreas and liver, especially bile, to break down the fat. And when the fat is broken down, it'll be broken down into smaller fuel packets that will get absorbed into the bloodstream. And when in the blood, triglycerides and lipids don't need insulin to get into the cell. They just go straight into, from the blood, through the cell membrane into the cell. Then they go to the mitochondria with a little carrier system, and they get utilized as fuel. No insulin necessary. That's why if you're on a ketogenic diet, or a well-formulated ketogenic diet, even if you're insulin resistant, you do fine, as long as you have enough fat. But the problem is, again, as I mentioned before, sometimes people who do it on their own and they don't have a coach to kind of dial in the amount of fat and protein and carbohydrate, sooner or later you're going to have to add a little ingredient of increased exercise, or sooner or later you have to add a little ingredient or take away a little ingredient of the fat that's available, because the season changes what's available in the grocery store. So there's always going to be variability, and that's why it's so crucial to have a coach that knows what they're talking about, especially if you're exercising. If you add a little bit more exercise, you're going to have to change that source, because a fat is an excellent fuel source. But if you're doing burst exercise, like Patty said, she's doing heavy weight training now. I'm not sure if Patty's doing HIIT training, Tabata training, CrossFit, or just lifting heavier resistance. By the way, selfless plug, on February 29th, I'll be having Ignite Your Life Part 2, because I'm having a lot of people fall off the wagon. So we're going to reinitiate just a Part 2 on Ignite Your Life, but it'll be here at Endorphin Effect near my office. Across the driveway, next to the Walgreens. In fact, it was the old Walgreens, now it's Endorphin Effect. February 29th, I'll be posting it probably here. I can't sell tickets just yet, but it'll be on soon. So anyway, check my Facebook page and keep on subscribing to find out when I do the videos that'll invite you to ignite your life. So when you do keto and you're doing powerlifting, some burst exercise, you will need carbohydrate. Unfortunately, muscle, especially sprinters, need carbohydrate to use as a fast fuel to push type 2 muscle fibers. Type 2B, type 2X muscle fibers are really important. Type 1 is more endurance. Type 2s are the aggressive ones that need to have carbohydrate. I think in the long run, if you're doing moderate exercise, you can use fat as your fuel source for any kind of exercise, but more of aggressive exercises, you'll have to have carbohydrates. And I think that's why Patty was cycling with her. She was introducing carbs because she was bursting more with her activities. And that too, you have to have a coach to kind of dial in the type of activity you're doing, or for fear that you might hit the wall, which is what I fear Patty's doing. She was okay with a certain amount of fat as far as a ketogenic diet. Probably getting a good amount of energy, probably sleeping great, probably losing fat stores in the stomach because the body and its metabolism knew how to utilize fat instead of carbohydrate, and it went for the fat source in the belly and the subcutaneous tissue. So I should go like this: subcutaneous tissue, love handles, under the arm, on the butt, belly. So all those areas of stored fat, depot fat, you could take advantage of. I mean, it's there for insulation, but it's also there as a fuel source, just like what people who have the thrifty gene, Samoans, Pima Indians, the Inuit, they all lived in that's supposedly why some people have a disadvantage in gaining too much weight with the same diet. These peoples all lived in conditions where starvation was imminent at certain times of the year. And if you're going to have a little bit of food before starvation season, it's supposed to go into the fuel battery. And that's why they get big fast versus people without the thrifty gene who can eat the same amount, and almost like being a 20-year-old with a high metabolic rate, they don't gain weight. It's amazing. So if Patty was doing a well-formulated ketogenic diet, mostly fat, and then she started exercising and then added a little more carbohydrate, well, what's going to happen when you add the carbohydrate? Insulin's going to come back. So when the carbohydrate comes in, insulin, or when you go from fat to carbohydrate, insulin gets jacked up again because your proportion of fat to carbohydrate, you have less fat, more carbohydrate, and when the body senses that you're having more carbohydrate, it'll secrete insulin. It has to. And when it secretes insulin, insulin has a half-life, insulin has a half-life in the body. It spikes, and then in about 2 hours it drops. In fact, it drops below the deck so that you become hypoglycemic, under low glucose. So when you become hypoglycemic, and it's very rare that you'll actually see that, insulin, it does work to bind with glucose that's found in the bloodstream, get into the cell, and then essentially make the bloodstream a ghost town for carbohydrate. But because of the brain being so sensitized to insulin and glucose, you will never bottom out. It's very rare to have a Samogi effect or a dawn phenomenon. Very rare. Unless you're on medicines. If you're on diabetes medicines, especially insulin, you will bottom out and you'll go into a coma. The likelihood is low. Most people will feel very irritated. They'll know when their glucose is getting low, and low to them might be normal to me. But when your glucose approaches like 40, that's when the brain says, ooh, I don't have any fuel source, especially if it's not adapted or flexible with its fuel source. So that's the other cool thing. If you're an athlete and you add a little bit of keto during the off season, your body gets to recognize two different fuel sources, and it can switch between fuel sources depending on the season. So my hopeful Olympians should maintain with whatever coach says, but my average Joes who are just doing marathons or 100-milers or triathlons, I think it's important to vary your fuel source, especially if you're overweight or if you're not the perfect BMI or if you have a little bit of a rice belly, a pudgy belly, even though you're exercising the heck out of your body. You might want to change your fuel source, change around the macros because it's so easy to do on your own. And if you notice that your exercise doesn't suffer, keep on with it, and hopefully in a due amount of weeks you'll see the change in waist and total weight without losing muscle mass. Hey everyone, I decided to cut this video into two because it was getting a little lengthy. I didn't realize how long it was. I probably should have chopped it up and got rid of the lulls in the video, but I only shoot once, edit once, and then it's on YouTube. So I honor your time in watching this. Hopefully the part one that you've watched so far is helpful. At another date, watch part two. It'll conclude everything and talk more about the details of the different food or diet types. And then part three will be for you guys, you athletes who want to hear about the weeds. I don't like getting into the weeds because it's very calculation heavy, and sometimes that gets me in trouble because I can't be your doctor. But I will tell you this now: if you are a diabetic, or if you have medical disease, or if you're on medicines, these videos should be approved by your doctor or your coach first. So please get the authority, whoever you're accountable to. If you don't have a doctor, then come hire me on my Herbal 411 website, and I can hopefully personally design your nutrition practice. But enjoy the videos. Again, don't forget to hit the notification button so you'll find out when I put out part two and part three, the In the Weeds one. So thanks for watching up until this point.